Gotta get it.
How about a Tesla?
Greatest car collection.
There's something you want to disagree with.
Teslas? Yeah. We disagree about Teslas, for God's sake.
Who can afford this other than like?
I'd like to. I'd like to. Well, so what? Rich liberals don't have to burn gas. That contributes to the general good, right?
I'll give you that.
Good morning. I'm Evan Cornog. I'm Dean of the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication here at Hofstra, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's panel on White House communication in the George W. Bush presidency. Each of our panelists is going to open with a short statement of their own perspective on the topic, and we will then have discussion among the panelists and finally invite audience participation. And I have a bit of bad news I have to give at the beginning here, which if you've looked at the dais here, you notice that Scott McClellan is not here. We learned yesterday that he's ill and is not able to make the trip. So we're very sorry that he will not be here. But we will try to soldier on as best we can. I also, this is a presentation of the Peter Kalikow Center for Presidential Studies here at Hofstra, and I just want to note the presence of Mr. Kalikow in the audience and thank him for his support of this important, long-standing initiative. So I'm going to just introduce the panelists and sit down and let them go in order. When we get to questions, and I will reiterate this at the time, I want to underline the word question. I'd like to give as many people here, and I'm sure more people will be arriving as we get underway, to give everyone time to ask questions. Please ask questions and not make statements, okay? Thank you. So I'll introduce all four of the panelists and then let them go in order. To my immediate left, Ron Christie now leads Christie Strategies, a media and political strategy firm that offers government relations and communications advice to a wide range of companies and organizations. Mr. Christie was Special Assistant to President Bush and Deputy Assistant to Vice President Dick Cheney. He has also been a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He is the author of 3 books, most recently Black Words: How Black Leadership is Returning America to the Days of Separate but Equal. Next to him, Howard B. Dean is former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, U.S. presidential candidate, and 6th-term governor of Vermont. He is now senior strategic advisor and independent consultant for the government affairs practice at the law firm McKenna, Long & Aldrich. And most important for today's event, he is senior presidential fellow of the Peter S. Kalikow Center for the Study of the American Presidency here at Hofstra. Julie Mason is the host of Sirius XM's Press Pool with Julie Mason, heard nationally weekdays from 3 to 6 on POTUS channel 124. Before joining Sirius XM, she was a White House reporter for Politico, the Washington Examiner, and the Houston Chronicle. She has more than 3 decades of experience covering state, local, and national politics, including 4 presidential campaigns. And I guess with Ted Cruz's announcement, we can make it officially 5. So congratulations. We'll give you another bar for your sleeve. Edward J. Rollins has a distinguished career as a political strategist and communications expert. He managed President Reagan's 49-state landslide re-election victory in the 1984 campaign and has played major roles in 9 other presidential campaigns. He has served in the administrations of 4 presidents. He is a frequent political commentator for Fox News and other networks, and like Governor Dean, he has been a senior presidential fellow at Hofstra's Peter S. Kalikow Center since 2009. And our first speaker will be Mr. Christie. Hi, Ron.
Dean, thank you, and thank you for that warm introduction for all of us, and good morning to all of you. Oh, wait a second. This is the 3rd day, this is the final day of the conference on the George W. Bush administration. Let me try that again. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you. Let me start by saying thank you to you, those of you here at Hofstra University, for the invitation to speak. I am honored to share the stage to give my perspective about some of the experiences that I had of dealing with communications in the Bush White House. But it's also a privilege to share the stage with friends. I've known Governor Dean for several years. We actually agree on issues more often than not, believe it or not, and we always joke about that. Julie Mason, who of course now is at Sirius XM, and I actually had the honor and privilege to host a show on the same POTUS channel 124 with former Governor John Huntsman on Saturday mornings, which is a thrill. And I particularly want to give a shout out to Ed Rollins, someone who I've known for a long time, and I'm honored to call both a friend and a mentor of mine. Now, I was in Dallas last Friday to get a chance to sit down with President Bush for a little while, and I can tell you that he is very happy, he is very healthy, and he's in great spirits following his administration. The president was at the Bush Presidential Center to unveil something called America's Pastime, America's Presidents. And if you know anything about George W. Bush, he is a huge baseball buff, and so what better opportunity to find the former president in good spirits to talk about his favorite pastime. Now, how do you turn from Dallas, where the president was in good spirits last week, to a conference here at Hofstra in Long Island to talk about the George W. Bush administration in general, and more particularly to talk about how we communicated in the White House? And so I think, of course, the best place for me to start is the beginning. I started in day one in the George W. Bush White House as the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor to Vice President Cheney before moving over to be a Special Assistant to President George W. Bush in 2002. And from day one, what we tried to do was we tried to define how the president would communicate his policies to the American people who had elected him, as well as our friends and allies around the world. And in the way that we sought to do this, in the opening days, Karl Rove, who was the president's senior advisor, he had an organization that he brought together on a fairly regular basis of all the senior staff in the White House. And he nicknamed the group, or he dubbed the group, the Blair House Group. And if you have to ask why, yes, they did actually meet in the Blair House. And what they did is they sat down and they looked at the president's policies, they looked at his messaging, they looked at all sorts of things of how are we positioning President Bush for success, and how do we make sure that we keep him there and keep him on message. And again, these were the most senior folks, the folks with the title of Assistant to the President, which in a White House, the folks who are at the most senior level, the Assistant to the President, which would be the National Security Advisor, the Press Secretary, all those folks would gather around. But Karl Rove was pretty smart. He recognized that those who sit around the senior staff table in the White House every morning might not necessarily give him the most candid advice and the candid approach. So he dubbed and brought together a second group, of which I was a part of, called the Conspiracy of Deputies. And he figured, well, the deputies have nothing to prove except, of course, giving their candid counsel to Rove, and they might be a little bit more forthcoming about really, where are we? Is the president really messing up, or is the president doing a good job? Now, I bring this up because in one of the earliest meetings that we had, the Conspiracy of Deputies, we sat down and we thought, what does a George W. Bush presidency look like? This is early, of course, in 2001. How are we going to make our mark? How are we going to communicate to the world who we are? The first thing that we sought to do and that we talked about is we wanted to be a different kind of Republican. We wanted to position the president as a different kind of Republican and communicate that as such. And to do this, we wanted to look at new ways to communicate our policies. We wanted to offer new solutions. And of course, we want to look to try to find different coalitions that we could build upon beyond our traditional base that had elected him to office. And second, one of the things that we wanted to do is to make sure that President Bush could try to change the tone in Washington and to communicate that he sought to change the tone in Washington. Here, we argued over things like, how do we stress personal responsibility? How do we share credit for success with our allies? And of course, how can we treat others with dignity and respect rather than attacking one another? And concurrent to these efforts that I just mentioned, we also sought to deliver on what we promised. And for President Bush, that meant, of course, number one, reforming public education. Number two, finding ways to have institutions of faith to work together, to modernize Social Security, and of course to find a prescription drug benefit as part of the Medicare program. Now, I'll let the historians assess our specific track record of success, but I think if you look at many of the domestic accomplishments that we sought out to do, I think that we did a fairly good job. Now, before I close, I want to really give you a sense, very briefly, on how we communicated internally to make sure that our message was being articulated properly to the country and to the world. Now, twice a week, Karl Rove and Karen Hughes would bring together a group called the Message Meeting. And in case you're wondering, yes, we talked about the message. But what was the message? We would talk about President Bush's calendar the day following the day we were sitting in a meeting, and we'd go 3 months out. And we'd talk about everything from who he would meet, where he would travel, what he would visit, and what he would say, and to make sure that we were on message. Did we have a strong theme? Did we have a purpose? And of course, with the President of the United States, the most valuable commodity that they have is their time. Were we properly utilizing his time? Now, beyond this, we would sit and we would say, we need to make sure that his policy time, the policies that he's articulated, when you look at No Child Left Behind, when you look at modernizing Social Security, that time was well spent as well. And if message meetings were those to sort of take it beyond the walls of the White House, I think the most difficult meeting that I had to be a part of was something called the policy deputies. And Josh Bolten, who was then our White House Chief of Staff, would bring together every single policy deputy in the White House policy organs. That's the Domestic Policy Council, that's the Homeland Security Council, those are the folks at the National Security Council, and we'd say, I need time on the President's calendar next week. And we had these big easels that were on Josh's back wall, and it would say, Monday, there's 20 minutes available, Tuesday, there are 10 minutes available, and literally, Josh would let the policy deputies fight it out. I need 5 minutes of the President's time because X. And then another deputy might say, well, Ron, that doesn't make sense because the theme of the message that we have this week, that's off message. That's not what the President is seeking to talk about. And from an internal perspective of making sure that we really zealously guarded his time so that he could prepare for his speeches and prepare to go out and to interact with the American people, as well as our internal discussions of dealing with folks of, if you're going to get to the Oval Office, you got to make sure that you're utilizing that time properly. We felt in the first term of the Bush administration, this was the best way for us to move forward beyond the podium, beyond the press secretary, and it's a shame that Scott McClellan is not with us this morning because there's so much more complex apparatus at play in a White House, and particularly the George W. Bush White House, of are we on message, are we communicating, and are those communications resonating? And I'll leave you with a funny story. So it's not all seriousness, and it's not all, is it all about poll numbers and, where's the president coming up, coming down? So after 9/11, the Vice President of the United States was often in secure and undisclosed locations that we euphemistically dubbed as the cave. I'm a big fan of Saturday Night Live, and on one particular Saturday night, they had Darrell Hammond, the comedian, who had been tasked to play Dick Cheney. And they had him in this little cave in Afghanistan, and he had a little, where his heart was supposed to be, he had a little coffee maker, and it said, I'm invincible, I'm invisible, and oh, this is Sanka, tastes great. And I went to our policy meeting with Cheney, where of course we're supposed to focus on policy, and I said, hey boss, did you see that Saturday Night Live skit they did about you with Darrell Hammond? And he said, no, I didn't. And I said, oh, well, I happened to bring a copy. This is a VHS for you students who don't have VHS machines. And we put it in the machine, and Scooter Libby looked like he was going to kill me. And the vice president was laughing, but it just goes to show that we paid very close attention not only to the way that we sought to communicate with the public, but what the public wanted to communicate back to us, both through satire as well as through serious discussions. Thank you all very much, and I really look forward to our discussion.
So thank you, Ron. That was, I've never been inside a White House press operation, and certainly not the Bush White House press operation. So I'm going to take a slightly different tact. I think that most people here know that I have extremely strong views about this particular president's administration and his successes or lack of same, both on foreign and domestic, which I don't see a lot of point in reiterating. But I do want to make some observations that I think are fair and will be surprising to most of you. First of all, I knew President Bush for 6 years while he was governor and I was governor, and he's a good guy, and I liked him a lot. And he was quite a stand-up guy. He kept his word on some business dealings between Vermont and Texas that he didn't have to do. It refunded us some money that we thought we were owed, and he was probably within his legal rights not to take. So I like him as a human being. I had some personal interactions with my family that caused me to do that. And the other thing is that he was a very good politician. And he doesn't get a lot of credit for being a great politician because he followed, in my view, the greatest politician since Franklin Roosevelt in terms of his political skills, which was Bill Clinton. You won't see another Bill Clinton in your lifetime, and I'm talking to the students here. The last one with his talent was not Jack Kennedy, it was Franklin Roosevelt, and we don't see people like that very often. Bush was a very good politician. He was good with people. He related to people well. And I tell you these two things in context because I think the relationship between the media and George W. Bush was not a great one, although it often isn't with presidents. It's not a particularly good one now. And it's partly because of the character of the media, which I want to spend the bulk of my time on. I divide the Bush presidency from a PR point of view into four. The first is the post-election phase. He really, the election was a disputed election. In fact, I would argue that Al Gore actually won, but the Supreme Court decided to do something different. And I actually say that not to be a smart ass and antagonize Ron, who's clearing his throat and taking his blood pressure pills madly. I say that because there actually is a mechanism to elect the president when the election is in dispute, and it has nothing to do with the Supreme Court. It's Congress. And my view is that Gore was partly responsible for what happened with Bush versus Gore because he could have just said, well, we appreciate the Supreme Court's views, but the Congress has the ultimate say. And we might have lost that anyway. But so I think his numbers after he got to be president were not as good as most presidents would be because it wasn't this sort of coronation. It was a really ugly process. Then there was the post 9/11, and his numbers were in the 90s for the same reason that every president who takes who presides over a country which has been attacked, or a president who presides over a country where troops are sent in America's interest, their numbers are great, and everybody wants to support the president regardless of how far away they may be in their political views. Then came the Iraq War, and initially, of course, there was a huge surge of support for the president because these were our troops, and everybody conflates supporting the troops and supporting the president. That began to be a liability after it had been there for a while. And finally, and I think that this was in some ways, he never recovered from this, it was Katrina. And I'd love to know from Ron, because I have no idea whose idea it was to send him over looking out of the jet down on 1,000 people or whatever was had been drowned. But again, I want to reiterate this by saying I like George W. Bush as a human being. And I don't think that he meant any of the things that people accused him of meaning. I think it was a PR blunder. And it probably wasn't his fault. Let me just say one last thing, since I'm about to hand it off to a member of the Fourth Estate. I think the press has been a failed institution in this country for at least 3 presidencies. And I think, I mean it in this way. The relationships between the chief executive have of necessity been somewhat hostile for a long time. And I think that's a good thing. I teach a foreign policy course. And one of the things, it's amazing to me to look at the old, even back to Eisenhower and even Kennedy, where press members would be herded into the Oval Office. They'd have a conversation with the President of the United States, maybe 4 or 5 or 6 people, almost always men in those days, of course. And then on the way out, the press secretary would say, by the way, boys, that was all off the record. And it would be off the record, and it would never appear in print. Now, that's an incredibly cozy relationship that really is not in the best interest of democracy to have that kind of a relationship. Since that time, it's the opposite. We're at the opposite pole, and it leads to all kinds of problems. And we're at the opposite pole not because reporters are evil people, although there's a few, like there are in every profession. We're at the opposite pole because of the corporatization of the media. And it's not because the media is the corporations that own the media, with the exception of one channel, Ed, where the owner whispers in the ear about what not to say, and you can't cover this and you can't cover that. It's because the corporatization of the media, every news show is now a profit center. Walter Cronkite, the most respected man in America, used to lose money for CBS every year. Bill Paley didn't care because he had the most viewers, and he could make it all up, feeding into, Beat the Clock or whatever was next after the news. Today, if you're not making money, you're getting your staff cut, you're getting your salaries cut, you can't send foreign operations. Even the best news organizations in America don't have nearly the foreign coverage they once had. AP is a shadow of its former self in terms of its employees and where it covers. And this is because the news has become a profit center and is driving down the quality of news. The pressure in newsrooms is enormous. It's not get it right anymore, it's get it first and then we can fix it later in the subsequent editions. And it is murderous. And you used to work for Politico, and I know people, of course, in Washington, the pressure is so great. You may do 4 or 5 or 6 stories in a day. In the old days, you used to do 2 stories in a week, and that was a big deal, and get your byline out there. So it's a very different industry, and it's not. I think it's not as different industry simply because there are terrible people who are reporters. I don't believe that. I don't think that's not true. Reporters are interesting and they're fun and they want to do the right thing and they're usually in it for the right reason. But the pressure on them to do things for the wrong reason is enormous, and it affected President Bush. It affected President Obama. It President Clinton. And it may have started with Nixon. I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure when the magical time was that it suddenly went south on us, but it's an enormous, enormous problem. And all these 3 presidents, certainly Clinton, Bush, and Obama, have created walls where they don't talk to the media, they manipulate the media, they give certain people favorable interviews essentially on the unspoken deal that if they get a bad article, they'll never get another interview like this. It's a very, very tough environment, and I think it didn't serve President Bush well, it hasn't served President Obama well, and it didn't serve President Clinton well. And I think it's a big problem, and I think we're going to have a debate not just about what happened in the Bush administration, we're going to have a big debate about where the future of the media is and what the social media means, and that there's no referee and no editor anymore. But I would argue that there hasn't been an editor for a long time, because I know a lot of reporters who basically say the editor writes the story before you go get the quotes and then comes back and remassages the story once you get back to the newsroom. That's not a good model, and we need the fourth estate. You can talk about Wall Street and Congress failing. They can fail, but what you cannot have is a press that doesn't exert its freedom and its judgment, because that's the only reason that democracy works. The only reason that democracy works is somebody independently has to hold us accountable for what we do in the political stream, and that's been a very, very difficult task in the last 3 presidencies.
Thanks, Governor. No, I don't disagree with anything you said. I would add on top of that people expect their news for free now. They don't want to pay for it, and it's a big problem. Yes. It's a big problem. And maybe at some point today we can talk about why your friend George Bush never made it to Vermont, the only state in the United States where he never went.
Only 4 electoral votes. 3 electoral votes.
There was a warrant out for him.
They also had a crazy governor up there.
Yeah. There was a lot going on with Vermont. For me, obviously, the major story on coverage of the Bush administration, when we talk about the Bush administration, is what I think many of us can agree is the stunning failure of the news media to provide a critical bulwark against the administration's highly effective propaganda campaign to sell the war in Iraq. That's Scott McClellan's term, the propaganda campaign. But it's wrong to say that no one in the media asked questions at this time. The questions were asked. The answers were terrible that we got from this administration. Freedom is on the march was a regular answer. Also, the strategy is victory and the evil ones. There are also a number of factors, I think, that we forget, sort of atmospherics around this time that must be considered in context when we talk about press coverage of the Bush administration. As the governor mentioned, Bush's approval ratings were very strong. The average for his first term was 62%. Can you imagine? Barack Obama would kill a man to get to 62% right now. Overall, it fluctuated in his first term from 90% down to about 52%. Still incredibly good for our first-term president. People were terrified after 9/11. They were willing to believe anything. After a strong effort by the administration to conflate 9/11 and Iraq, 70% of Americans in one poll agreed that Iraq was responsible for 9/11. Of course, even the administration was kind of saying in the side of their mouth, Iraq had nothing to do with it, but we were attacked and Saddam must go. So at the same time, while all this was happening, the news industry was in a crisis. It's gotten a little bit better now. It's leveled off, but as the governor mentioned, still in terrible shape. By the end of the Bush administration, more than 17,000 journalists had lost their jobs because of the recession, not because of President Bush. These included hundreds in Washington, D.C., including me. I got laid off in the very last days of the Bush administration from from a newspaper where I had covered news for 20 years. And I was the White House reporter, so everyone was losing their jobs. It was terrible. It was a scary, depressing, miserable time in the industry. And I think what a lot of us forget when we want and hope journalists to occupy the church of truth, that it is a business, and these businesses don't make money anymore. And it's really, really tough. Even when you look at the Washington Post right now, which is a wonderful paper with a terrific history, a lot of their headlines are clickbait, written like on the fly, very fast by kids sitting at desks that don't make a lot of phone calls, that don't get out of the office very much. But back to the first Bush term. Democrats in Congress, many Democrats in Congress were echoing what the administration was saying about Iraq, making the very same statements. There was not, naysayers were sidelined and marginalized and sort of made fun of. There wasn't much of a robust opposition for journalists to cover. Shortly after 9/11, of course, we had the anthrax attacks targeting Washington leaders and journalists. In the meantime, the FBI director said that another terrorist attack was inevitable, and all night long over Washington, D.C., fighter jets patrolled the skies, and meanwhile, the D.C. sniper attacks began. So all this was going on all at once. And we talk about like going from crisis to crisis now. That's what it was like back then. And it's hard to remember now, but these were the days of love you W and get her done. And Norman Greenbaum was proud to be an American, and we heard it over and over. And it seems like so long ago. And of course, Bush left office with 2 unpopular wars, a 35% job approval rating, an uncertain legacy. It's very chic now in these later days to complain about the news media. Why didn't the media do its job? And I stipulate much of that. There was some critical reporting. A lot of people didn't want to hear it. When a president has a 90% approval rating, they don't want to hear a lot of gripey stories from the press. But I just wanted to put some of that in perspective to describe what it was like to cover Bush at the time. There are so many other big stories, and I hope we get to them, including, of course, Katrina, the president's trip to Graceland with the Japanese prime minister, which for me was a very high point. Of course, why Bush never went to Vermont, and Jenna's wedding. That was a highlight. Thank you.
Can you imagine every day you get up and you go to work at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning? Every single day you've got world crises to deal with. You have economic crisis to deal with. You basically start a day, most of the White House staff comes in at 7, 8 o'clock, you have the senior staff meeting. The president starts having meetings all day long. Spend 60, 70% of your time dealing in international events, probably higher today. You do a very effective job. You keep trying to make big decisions all day long. And the people that are going to interpret what you've done are the press corps. And so it's not that we try and manipulate you. And if you look around this room, this is about the size of what a press corps is every day. And a press secretary steps out front and stands up and says, here's what the president did today, and here's why we did it, and what have you. And then you try and coordinate the message. I think President Bush, who I'm a big fan of, and I think obviously had as troubled the presidency as any man in the sense that he inherited things that came into the environment. I think he learned a lot from his dad, and he didn't want to duplicate his dad. He wanted to duplicate a lot of what the Reagan administration did, and I was a part of the Reagan administration. And we stepped in our premise, and it was a much different environment to deal with in those days. We were going to control our own story. We weren't going to let the national media. You had a job to do, and we understood you had a job to do, and you were not going to write our press releases, and you were not going to. So how can we basically drive our message, our story, and do it in a very coordinated way? Now, unfortunately for first President Bush, 41, when he got elected, and he thought, okay, I'm going to do it differently than President Reagan did. I'm not going to have the coordinated effort. I'm not going to have a story of the week. I'm not going to have everybody talking on the same page. I'm going to go out and meet with the press. Throw anything at me that you want to throw at me, and he did. And unfortunately, when you do that, if each and every one of you are writing a story, and it's not a controlled story, and you ask questions, then basically you go 25 different directions. And I think to a certain extent, even though 41's presidency is being re-examined and given much higher marks than it was when he left office, but to the Bush people, Bush W43, Your father had lost. A very good man had lost, and why did they lose? And when they went back and looked at things, part of it was that they weren't able to tell their stories effectively. So when they came into office, and I wasn't a part of the administration, I was just an observer of it, and you were, Christie, and I think you'll agree with me. They had an extraordinary woman in there, named Karen Hughes, and Karen had been one of President Bush's closest advisors. She'd been a newswoman, anchor in Texas. She came up with him, and she was clearly one of the real strengths of his administration initially. R.A. Fleischer, who was the first press secretary, had not been a Bush person. He'd been Elizabeth Dole's person. But Karen had a great relationship with the president and could put real discipline into it and wasn't afraid of Karl Rove. And Karl Rove obviously had to tread carefully around her. Unfortunately, she left after 2 years in the administration to go back home. She had a young family, and there were pressures for her to go back. She came back in the administration later as the Deputy Secretary of State. But I think when she was there was a real discipline. I think they lost a little bit of the discipline. And obviously, when you've got stories like the bombings of the trade centers and the Pentagon and what have you, and all the variety of things, you sort of lose track of whatever it is that you want to. You want to talk about education, everybody else wants to talk about something else. Equally as important, I don't think you can ever underestimate the difference in the media today. We take it all for granted. You young people don't know any difference. But when we were in the Reagan White House, which was sort of the beginning of the modern, how do you control television, how do you control your story? Others had tried it before, but I think we did it pretty effectively. We had CBS, NBC, ABC, PBS. CNN in 1981 first came into existence, and the White House did not accredit them. They had to go into federal court, and the 4 networks went against them, said they weren't a legitimate news agency, and a federal judge basically said they are a news agency. We had to accredit them. The world changed dramatically. And by the time you got to Bush 43, you didn't just have CNN. You had Fox, you had CNBC, you had MSNBC, you had the main news, and it was the beginning of the blog era. So it used to be you could control your story. Whatever the New York Times, the Washington Post published that morning, your job all day long was to make sure your story didn't get complicated by what they were covering, and your battle was to make sure on the network news that night, going from 1 million people reading it in the New York Times, the Washington Post, to 30 or 40 million people watching on TV. So you had an entire day to basically manipulate, manage, I don't like manipulate, but manage your story. Today, it's instant. Today, something breaks, 15 seconds later, it's on a blog, 30 seconds later, it's on one of the networks, it's on one of the cable news network. And I think when the Bush people came in, particularly after the feeding frenzy that went on during the Clinton administration, I agree with Howard. Bill Clinton was the most gifted politician I've seen in my lifetime, and I've worked for a couple pretty good ones. But he understood politics very, very well. Didn't control his message all the time very well. And I think to a certain extent, so a lot of what the Bush people wanted to do was really control the message, make sure what we thought was important. Again, not writing your press release or your stories, what we thought was important that we tried to get out there. The other had a very important, and I think you can never underestimate this, George W. Bush would go nuts about leaks. And so they really had a no-leak policy. And I mean, there was a great discipline in that White House about not leaking stories. And every time there was a leak, and I'm reminded again, to tell Reagan stories. This is about one time Bill Casey came into the senior staff of the White House, which is about 12, 14 people, to complain about CIA stuff getting leaked. And 15 minutes after he left, Ann Devroy, who was the White House correspondent for the Washington Post, said that 8 people in that meeting had called to say Bill Casey was in there briefing about leaks. They had leaked the story. We had a pretty leaky ship in our administration, and I think obviously other administrations had. So I think the discipline was there. I think the team was good. I think a lot of the problem was the press had changed dramatically, and it's there today. It's now forever, even though we've lost a lot of the great editors and the great entities that used to be we can't consider mainstream media. Today, you've got so many fundamental differences out there today, and those 17,000 journalists that got displaced, unfortunately now can all write blogs or do whatever without an editor trying to make sure the stories weren't there. So I think the Bush administration was affected more by the events and the lack of an ability to control that environment. You don't control wars, you don't control terrorism, you don't control the economic breakdown. And as much as they attempted to do all that, and I think they were pretty darn good at it, the stories were just overwhelming. So I give them great credit. I think that the American public never got to see the George W. Bush that a lot of us saw. He was an extremely personable man. He was a smart man, much smarter than people gave him credit for. Obviously, he had a very big player that we've talked about, Dick Cheney, as his vice president. Cheney also didn't deal with the press, but had a very capable person in Mary Madeline, who was one of his assistants, senior advisors, who knew the media as well as anybody. So, I mean, I think that there were a lot of counter forces, but I think at the end of the day, it was more the circumstances and the changing in the environment of the national news media that had some real impact on the presidency, and to a certain extent, not the decisions that were made had an impact on the end point, but I think it's awful hard to sell good stories on wars. It's awful hard to sell good stories on economic crisis. But I think he, in a different environment, with a different economy, would have been sitting here praising a president who obviously understood the media, understood the country very, very well.
So the first thing I'd like to do is just ask, give the panelists the opportunity to respond to anything they've heard said that they'd like to weigh in on before I ask a question or two. Is there anything?
I appreciate the remarks from all the other panelists about what a likable guy George W. Bush was. We always used to joke that he was smarter and meaner than he got credit for, but he also respected the role of the press, and he would have us to his ranch for dinner. We went a couple times. President Obama couldn't name 10 people who've spent the last 6 years covering him. Bush knew everybody's name and the cameramen and their wives, and really was very personable and really fun to cover.
So I have a question actually about that, which I don't know the answer to. Why, I think he was the first president that did this. Before he had a press conference, they would actually decide ahead of time who was going to be called on and in what order.
Yeah,
How,
they still do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Obama still does that, but I think Bush was the first one to do that. And
Was he?
I think
Clinton
so.
didn't come out with a
think he
list?
was.
I don't know.
I don't think Clinton,
Yeah.
no.
Well,
Paging Dr. Dean.
Oh, it's George Bush's,
That's
it's Karen
what
Karen
Hughes.
Hughes.
I disagree with what you had to say, Governor.
I think part of that, it used to be, again, there was an order, and so people who got called on in press conferences prior to Clinton, what have you, were basically, the AP always started, then you went to the UP, then you went to the networks, and then you went to the big major press. I think what happened over that is you couldn't distinguish anymore who was important. So, anybody get their hand up, wear a red dress, wave most aggressively. And once Helen Thomas got retired, you sort of. So I think again, I'm sure that was a part of the discipline. Let's not call on someone who's going to make a commentary about, not ask us a question, but make a commentary, which so many of them did. You would see that the Fox person, the MSNBC person wanted to make a statement, and then basically, oh, by the way, Mr. President, you want to comment on my statement? So if I was there, I'd have done the same thing. So
it's annoying, but I don't think it's regarded as terribly sinister. For example, if the president wanted a question about the automakers bailout, they'd call on the Detroit News. I don't think anyone in the press corps would begrudge the Detroit News getting a question, and everyone expects TV to get a question and the wires, and then it's like which newspapers are going to get called on, but they spread it out pretty evenly over time.
Well, let me make one last
Except for the
observation.
New York Times, which was banned from the plane.
Yeah.
Which I have to say, I might have done too if I'd thought of it.
Let me make one last observation on something that Ed said that I think is really important to underscore, which is discipline. The Bushies were known for their discipline. And Ed's exactly right. You show up to the office at 6:30 in the morning, you stay until 8 or 9 at night, you come in and you work a usually 8-hour day on Saturday. And if it's the one thing that Andy Card, our first chief of staff, taught us was you never get out before the president. That is, you don't talk to the press about his policies until the president's announced them. You don't start sitting around and showing off to your friends and talking about, oh, well, this is what the president's going to do next week. No. When the White House press secretary has an announcement to make about the president's schedule or his policies, that's when it'll be made. And I think we were extraordinarily disciplined, at least in the first term. I was there from 2001 to 2004. And I think part of that is really the strong role that Karen Hughes had, particularly in those early years of, she was the enforcer, but she was also a brilliant strategic communication strategist. And I think a lot of folks with the passage of time have sort of forgotten about, that's really how we approached it. But discipline, first and foremost, for us was, it's the president's announcement and it's the president's position, not you and not about your ego of trying to get out in front of the president.
The other thing that was interesting, in that administration, some of the most powerful women became players, not just in the White House. We talked about Karen Hughes and Mary Matlin. You had Tory Clark in defense and others. I mean, you really had
Condoleezza.
You know, I mean, but the women in the press corps, I mean, the communications end, were very, very strong and obviously had great influence.
One of the things I'd like to ask you about, because it's Ed, you mentioned blogs, but we haven't talked a lot about, you know, the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration was happening at a time of unbelievable change in the media. And we glanced on that, but I just want to kind of lay out some things about that. I mean, to me, you know, one of the landmark moments came in September, actually it was September 11th of 1998, when the Starr report into various allegations against President Clinton was published, including in its entirety online. And a week before that, out in California, a little company called Google was incorporated. So, you know, you see, you know, there's not even really ripples in the water yet, but, you know, by, 2004, you have actually Howard Dean's campaign being a pioneer in the use of the web as a fundraising mechanism. You also have the beginning of surfacing of internet memes and various kinds of, the web as it approached. 2004 is also the year that the 60 Minutes 2, Dan Rather investigation into Bush's Texas Air National Guard service is exploded by bloggers who have a greater knowledge of typography than the producers at CBS seem to have. In 2006, Twitter gets underway, and you know, if you ask my students, a lot of them, that's the first place they're going to turn when news breaks. So, you know, this is a non-trivial change, and I guess my question is, how well do you think the Bush administration managed that change, and how were they leaders, or were they followers, or are they not even figuring it out?
Well, let me take a first stab at that. I think the way that we harnessed technology in the Bush administration, we were literally at a crossroads. And the crossroads came into play on September 11th of 2001. For those of us who were evacuated, who were at the White House that day, all the cell phone towers in DC, at least for our network, went down. And there wasn't a means or mechanism for a lot of us to communicate. And shortly after 9/11, the novel concept was introduced for White House staff that we would now carry a BlackBerry, which most of us had never heard of before, in order to communicate with each other. Well, okay, we'd heard of it, Governor, but we didn't have it then. And I think if you look at the way that we also used digital media, the White House photographer was still taking still photos in 2001, 2002, 2003. We didn't really digitize until 2004. And so when you look at the way that students communicate today, hashtag this, and I still don't understand Facebook, I think, and it's Ron_Christie for those of you on Twitter. I think for us, the challenge was recognizing that this new technology was out there, and how could we best not only hook the president into this new technology, but how could we utilize it as staff? And the president, you notice President Obama carries a BlackBerry. President Bush did not. President Obama uses email. President Bush did not. And so I think by the time you get into 2006, 2007, the White House staff was a lot more sophisticated of dealing with this emerging technology. But for our cousins now in the Obama administration, it's night and day, the technological capabilities that they have and the tools that they have at their disposal to get their message out versus what we had.
Mike Hayden, who was, among other things, one of Bush's CIA directors, gave a really interesting talk earlier today about the crossroads of change that's going on in terms of the security end of all of this. And it strikes me as listening to Ron, that the Bush administration was really at the crossroads of an enormous generational change in the world, not just in America. You had warfare, which had been essentially the business of nation states for 300 or 400 years, suddenly becoming now the business of individual groups who could use disruption. And even Al-Qaeda, as Mike said this morning, which I thought was a terrific talk, is now sort of an institution, and ISIS is the non-institution. It's really a sort of a doomsday cult, which is incredibly effective, using methods that nobody even could dream of, other than people like Charlie Manson, who didn't have the reach of ISIS. So the Bush administration was really, I think, at a crossroads of a lot of things that were happening in the world, not just the American generation of young people who were looking at institutions in a completely different way, all of government. And it happened to be that George W. Bush happened to be presiding over this, which I don't think has made his presidency any easier. I mean, I think one of the, in my view, misunderstandings, fundamental misunderstandings that we based going into Iraq on is that Iraq was actually a country. Well, it wasn't a country. Iraq was a creation of an agreement between European powers 100 years ago. It made no sense as a country. In a sense, I think what the president did in the Iraq War was to unroof all of that and create, and loose forces that nobody had any idea were as powerful as they were. And the same thing is true of technology. There's this enormous technological revolution going on around the world, and particularly led in the United States. And the Bush people just happened to be there at the time. And so to say that the Bush people really don't understand technology is not really fair. That would be kind of like saying, you know, William Shakespeare didn't understand literature 300 years later. I mean, it's just, you just got caught in an enormous historical change that affected everything, not just technology, not just the media, but the existence of the nation state itself began to change, and the fundamental beliefs of all the people who'd been trained in the past 40 or 50 years in the post-war order began to become unmoored during the Bush administration, which had nothing to do with George W. Bush himself or the people he hired. The rules were changing under their feet, and there was not a whole lot they could do about it except try to play catch-up.
I go back to the point about the discipline. You always want it in a campaign or in a White House. You can't tell 100 stories. You can tell one story. I'm sure the administration this week wanted to tell a story on basically the nuclear Iran, the negotiations that were going on and why you want to go on. You had a massive plane crash yesterday. You obviously have the bombings that started to take place last night. All of a sudden, whatever the original game plan was, you're on a different track. And the hardest part today with BlackBerries or iPhones or any of the rest of it is you see everybody sitting here with their iPhones like this, and there's a temptation to basically go off and respond to that. And as a press person or as a political strategist or what have you, to have that discipline to say, I just got this text from Julie here who wants an answer on this right now. And so I send a text off to her answering her question, and I've totally moved away from my agenda to her agenda. So the way to maintain this in the future is going to be extraordinarily harder. And I remember I was Mike Huckabee's chairman, and we were doing an event in Iowa where he was sort of catching some momentum there. And we did a room, again, when you get to Iowa, all of a sudden, by the end, if you start out going to pizza places and you have 10 people, by the end, you've got every major press person in the world, and you have big press conferences like this. We did a press conference, and we had probably 150 bloggers with another 500 on the phone. We made the mainstream media. We didn't let them ask questions, so they're all behind with the cameras, what have you. And I said, you know, this is the future, and but controlling that message is going to be very, very hard. So I think it just magnified 1,000 times what it used to be. It's like you walk into, I used to have an office in Times Square, and you walk into Times Square and you're bombarded by billboards and lights and the whole bit. Every one of those billboards costs $5 to $10, $20 million, plus the rental fees and the rest of it. And there's hundreds of them. And I defy anyone to walk through that Times Square and come out with a message. You could take any one of those billboards and move it to Des Moines, Iowa, and people would drive 50 miles to see the big billboard. Today we live in a world of clutter. So breaking through the clutter, whether it's your network or someone else's network, trying to find how you get your message told and how you have a consistency in that message is going to be an extraordinary challenge for both campaigns and White Houses, even more so.
Let me add very quickly, and it's just begun. It's going to get much worse. The number of Americans who watch the evening news on the three major networks is not only a fraction of what it was before, but the average age is well over 50. The average cable viewer on MSNBC is 62 years old. The average age of the cable viewer on Fox is 68 years old. And the reason those numbers are so high is because there's a bell curve and it stops at 35. Nobody under 35 watches any of this stuff.
Howard does MSNBC. I do Fox. We have a lot more viewers, but he.
It's because
So
they haven't.
150
They're just,
150 you
yeah,
have,
but
you
yours are
count
going to
personally.
age out faster. No, the truth of the matter is that all of this stuff, the evening news is fast. The evening news, which is still the biggest single way of getting the news out, is disappearing. So we're not at the end of this transition. We're in the first quarter. And so this problem of controlling message is only going to get more and more difficult as there become hundreds of thousands of ways that people get their news. And there's no, believe me, if something's on the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, maybe the LA Times, or on the 3 networks at night, it's still a big story. Not as big as it used to be. In 15 years, that may not be true anymore, if those institutions still exist.
To bring this back to the White House, one of the fascinating things to track over time is how seating in the briefing room has changed. The White House Correspondents Association just this week came out with a new seating chart. It's the correspondents who decide who sits where. It's not the White House. And if you look at, for example, during the Bush administration, it was all what we would now consider old media, legacy media, newspapers that don't even exist anymore, sitting in the briefing room. And this week they added BuzzFeed and Yahoo. So.
I want to ask one other question and then turn it over to the audience. And that's, Ron started out talking about the conspiracy of deputies, but also just kind of how to communicate first internally, but then externally the message. And you know, it's one of the things that I think people sometimes don't understand is that it's not as if, the word manipulation has come up. I mean, you would be irresponsible as a public figure if you weren't spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to get out the message you're trying to get out. Now, if you're lying, if you're deceiving, if you're concealing important evidence, that's one thing. But trying to get your message out there, and one of the things that I remember discovering when I went and worked in City Hall in New York back in the 80s is that if you were the press secretary, you had to be in the policy meetings because in fact, it's a very good thing for the public that somebody in the meeting is asking, how are we going to feel if this decision is on the front page of the Daily News? So if you could talk, maybe starting with you, Ron, about that, the way in which the PR people are not simply implementers of a strategy, but fellow strategy. I mean, that they are guiding policy at the same time as other people are, because I think that's an important thing to.
It's a very interesting question because one of the offices that you've probably never heard of, nor should you have heard of, is called the Office of the Staff Secretary in the White House. And I think this office, largely out of public view, largely unknown, is one of the most powerful offices in the White House because the staff secretary deals with all the paper flow that comes to and from the president. So suppose that you want the president, you've briefed him in the Oval Office and he said, Howard Dean, of course he wouldn't say Howard Dean, but Howard Dean, articulate what I want to do to get the tax cut through in 2001. Every head of every major White House office will look at Governor Dean's memo and say, oh, this looks good to me, or they'll say, paragraph 3, I don't agree with this. And before something gets to the president, every single department head, major department head, has to sign off on that document and say, the president's senior staff has seen this, we've gone to the cabinet agencies if necessary, this articulates what your policy position is. How that relates to getting in the Oval Office and the way that the press apparatus and the PR apparatus worked is that in our policy briefings, so when I was involved in the policy apparatus for the president for my last 3 years, I can't think of a time in the Oval Office that we didn't have either Ari Fleischer or Scott McClellan or someone from the communications office sitting there. And their presence was not as a policy role, but if they couldn't communicate what the policy was, what the message was, then we were off message. And going back to Ed's point, it was all about discipline and it was all about making sure that we were on the same page. And for us to stay on the same page, that meant the communicators and the policy geeks, for lack of a better word, had to find a way to work together. And the policy people obviously are saying, here's exactly what the president's policies are. And the communicators, of course, want to find a sexier way of putting it out there. Well, Ron, that doesn't work in a soundbite. And so we really had a really strong relationship with the press folks and the communicators
Because if they couldn't articulate what the president's policy was, it didn't matter what the policy position was that the president was trying to convey.
I think it's important not to think that PR, and I totally agree with Ron's premise, the press secretary plays a critical role and always has to be in the room, has to know what's happening. But public policy is not, in no administration I've been in Ford and watched a few others, you don't make decisions to basically do good PR. You have to sell your public policy decisions, but it's a very complex process, and the vast majority of presidents, the vast majority of people in White Houses and around administrations do what they think is in the best interest of the country. Then you got to sell it, and obviously these things are difficult to sell, and there's always a counterpoint. One of the difficulties you have in administration, no matter what the press secretary wants to do with the messages you want them, as I say, reporters can go out and do their own thing, and you've got a bunch of agencies that obviously today it may be more interesting to talk to the FAA administrator or someone in transportation or Homeland Security on the crash, in the tragic crash in the Alps as it is to something else. So you're always fighting to make sure that whatever your best plan is, that you can go out. But I think the key thing here that we have to understand, and one of the things that's occurring today that's never occurred before, is ISIS and all the rest of them understand American PR. And they're out there basically every day telling their story very effectively. Chopping off a man's head or crucifying a man or setting him on fire, people say, my God, that's so outrageous. That's what terrorism's about. They're doing that to basically create terrorism. And that's so all of a sudden you got a guy being beheaded on network television that night, and whatever the message of the day is in the White House is probably diminished dramatically, and they want you to respond to whatever that may be. So when I come back to the point about discipline, maybe that's not the best thing to do. Maybe that's not the best argument that you want to make. Maybe you don't want to get into that topic. So it's very, very hard, and there's a lot of conflicts in the White House and a lot of conflicts on the messaging side of it.
Bush called the press the filter, and he always said it like that, the filter. And he always wanted to go around the press and speak directly to the American people because he felt like the filter distorted his words and his intent and put it through a sieve of darkness that he didn't really feel like it held up well under that kind of scrutiny. He started, and President Obama has, I believe, perfected a system of state-run media where Bush, when I covered Bush, we thought he was terrible, no access, no accountability, no nothing. Well, compared to Barack Obama, Bush was like the most open, giving, sharing person you could possibly imagine, and his press shop was much more open, much more responsive to the needs of the press than the current administration. It's naturally a relationship at odds. Of course they want to come out and tell their good, positive, upbeat story, but that's, they have their own PR operation. That's not our function. That's not what we do. Certainly not what we want to do. They control through denial. Bush was great at taking questions on the fly, I mean, to the detriment of the control of the story of the day and the message of the day. He'd just sit there until you were done and be like, ha, and just take whatever questions you had on your mind. And in that way, the administration was able to move through stories quickly. Now what you see is President Obama holding back. We won't hear from him for months, and it's almost like this fire hose effect of this pressure building up. And when you finally get access to him, reporters are asking like 12-part questions, and no one can remember what question 3 was in that long soliloquy, but there's just so much to ask him, and there are so many things that we've never had a chance to ask him because the cycle just moves on and on. And when I talk about state-run media, I'm talking about photo releases. Instead of allowing photographers into the Oval Office for a routine bill signing of significance or something of note, which President Bush would do and often did and knew that it was to his advantage to do so, now we don't have that. We don't get that. Now we get a photo taken by a White House photographer that's handed out, which is really no different from them writing out a press release and handing it and expecting that to go in the paper without any sort of scrutiny or accountability. This president doesn't like the press. Bush didn't like what the press did, but he understood and respected the role that the press played. He was much more accessible in a casual way, like those Oval Office encounters, which you remember, reporters just standing there and lobbing questions at him. Well, President Obama doesn't like that. He doesn't do it. Throughout both administrations, reporters have found that the best information, most useful information came from outside the administration. So you sort of report around it. People on the Hill just love to talk, and they'll come out of a meeting in the White House and tell you everything. And so those people are gold. And also, in the diplomatic corps and sometimes in the agencies, but You don't go to the briefing and get your news. That is not what White House reporting is about.
So I'll just sort of share with you some of the tricks of the trade here. What we used to do when I was governor and also on the campaign is we would avoid the big papers. So when I got tired of the press corps in Vermont, I'd go out on the road and do small paper interviews. They never got a chance to interview the governor. They were thrilled, and they usually write it mostly the way I wanted to write it. The bigger papers wouldn't do that. When I was on the campaign trail, in defense of the big papers, they're not going to write the same story every day, but you're going to have to give the same speech every day, 5 times a day, because that's what you do on campaigns if you want to stay on message. So I'd give the speech for the 25th time on a Friday, and the big papers aren't going to write that. They're going to find something else. They're going to delve into some lead that some opposition researcher gave them and this kind of stuff. So of course it's in my interest to limit that, and that's why you have these kind of tactics that people use. And in defense of President Obama, I would say one of the reasons he doesn't do many bill signings is Congress doesn't pass many bills.
I just use that as an example. He met with Hillary Clinton this week, and it wasn't on the schedule, and they announced it after the lid. And
if you'd been Hillary Clinton, would you have wanted anybody in that meeting?
No, it's a newsworthy event. It's a newsworthy event. No, I mean, it's funny when he does it, but I mean, you're just setting up a system where the next president, Ted Cruz, is going to bring it to the next level.
Yeah.
From your lips to God's
For your lips to God's ear, may he be nominated by the Republican. I may become a Republican just to vote for Ted Cruz in the primary.
You heard it here first. So let's, we're going to start with questions, and we got a couple of people here, I think, with microphones. I'd like to go to student questions first, if we can, and once again, please do a question. Right there, yeah. Okay, we'll come to you.
Good morning, panel.
We'll come to you next.
Thank you. David Strack, Lawrence Herbert School of Communication. This question is for Mr. Christie. I was wondering, what was the message being communicated after the week of 9/11?
It was a tough day for the country. It was a tough day to be in the White House, and it was a tough day to advise, for me at least at that point, the Vice President of the United States. Our entire focus went from what we called domestic priorities, getting No Child Left Behind passed, to working on a tax cut, to domestic consequences. How do we reopen New York City beneath 14th Street? We grounded all civil aviation. We closed most of the maritime ports in the country. And the president, a few days later, had the national prayer celebration. And in the days after 9/11, our focus went to prayer and remembrance for those who had lost their lives, as well as the opportunity to try to heal as a country. So when you look at what our message was, President Bush tried to reassure the country that every agency and every entity was doing everything that they could to prevent an attack on the country again, and that we also needed to move forward, and that we needed to heal, and that the terrorists would win if we succumbed and sort of sat around and felt sorry for ourselves. So it was a very difficult period for us as a country, and it was very difficult in the White House. But ultimately, I think, and Julie mentioned this earlier, that you noticed that his approval ratings did go up in the 90s, because at least the early messaging, people felt that he was doing everything he could to protect the country.
Two important things that he did, and I know the question wasn't aimed at me, but just as an observer, there was a memorial at the National Cathedral, and there've been lots of stories about the president, what was going on in the White House, and the president off reading to young kids and what have you, and no one was sure who was going to be in charge. And we had this extraordinary service, televised, and I would say the vast majority of Americans interested in the time were watching more television. And Billy Graham gave this extraordinary speech as one of the great religious leaders of this country. And the president followed him. As he was walking up, I said to myself, having worked for several presidents, I said, if there's ever a time you got to hit a home run, it's now. And he did. He basically got up in front of that audience, and following Billy Graham, which is not easy, and he gave an extraordinary speech. He went right straight from there, came up to New York, and then you had the great photograph of him down with the firefighters and the former firefighter and him on the stage. And those two events, the visual was more powerful than the message, and the message was, we're in charge, we're not going to let them beat us, it's a time to come together. So sometimes the activity, someone mentioned earlier, the flyby on the Katrina, I mean, that was a foolish effort on the White House to show that the president was not in charge, and it was a White House picture, was not a deliberate effort. But the president's activities sometimes are more powerful than anything else, and I think that was the message, that he was back in charge. They weren't going to let us get to us, and I think that was the president at his finest, because it was him, and he's a man of real integrity, a man who was always underestimated, and basically rose and grew in a job under very, very difficult times.
Can we do the question 2 rows in front of the, can you bring the mic down, excuse me, to the person 2 rows in front of the last one? Thank you.
Hi, this is for any of the panelists, but I was wondering if you could talk about the effect that new technology and modern media, the state of the modern media has had on speech writing. You know, is the era of a great memorable speech over, or can it be adapted to fit within 140 characters?
I don't think it's over, because I think there's always going to be a role for that. There's been a couple of things said up here that I think are really incredibly important to remember. One is the president has a role, and everybody looks to the president at a time of great crisis. And at that time, everybody is going to focus on that, and anybody who doesn't focus on that is not going to be paid attention. If you write a blog about recipes on a day where something like that's going on, you know, fine, good luck, but that's what people are focusing on. The other part is that something that Ed said in passing, which I think is incredibly important to remember for communications majors, especially, but for anybody, is the visual is always more important than what you say. Always. When I want to find out how effective a television commercial is on, I turn the sound off. If I want to find out if somebody's done well in a debate or not, if it's on television, I turn the sound off. Because it doesn't matter what you say, it's how you say it. If you look confident, if you look like a leader, if you look like a president, then you've done well. And it almost doesn't matter unless you've said something that's just absolutely outrageous, which some of us on this stage have done from time to time, but
You're not alone there, Howard.
but those are the things you really have to, but there is always going to be a role for a central performance at a time of crisis, and that is, as Ed said, when you have to hit it out of the park. And as Ed also said, the visual is all, and the visual of George Bush standing up there with a bullhorn, he could have said, I'm having spaghetti for dinner, but as long as he looked forceful and like he meant it, he would have still gotten great cred.
I do think one thing that's very important about speeches in the future for any of you wannabe speechwriters. Ronald Reagan, and I traveled every day with him for 6 years, said to me one day, how long do you think I can hold an audience? I don't know, until the free world, it was one of the most greatest speech makers ever. I said, oh, Mr. President, long he said, no, Ed, he said, watch the audience. He said, first of all, when a president gets up, he said the first 5 minutes is kind of an adulation, and it doesn't matter what you say, they pay a lot of attention to you. So it's like he was a Meyer where you had 220 sprinters instead of 200 meters. He said, it's like a 220. You get out fast, you coast in the middle, and you kick it in the end. He said, you can hold an audience, watch the audience. He said, for about 20 minutes, 23 minutes. He said, why do you think television shows are 23 minutes, 7 minutes of commercials? And he said, my point is, you can't have the Bill Clinton speeches that go on for an hour and a half and keep adding points. You really have to think in terms of, in the future, getting your message across in 20, 25 minutes and make it count and make it memorable and have some lines in there. One of the things that as I started my life as a speechwriter, and Richard Nixon was the guy who's not viewed as a guy who was a great speechmaker, although he had great writers and great people around him. He used to make them underline a line. What was the sound bite that was going to be on the network news that night? And you had to basically guess that. And 90 times out of 10, once you do this drill, you know where it's going to be, and that's the sound bite, because that's all the sound bite's going to be, 8, 10, 12 seconds. And so you now have to put together a string of 8 or 10 sound bites, but you have to weave that together. I think it's more difficult to write speeches today, and they need to be uplifting than it's ever been before. Sometimes, and the interesting, one of the great speechwriters for Reagan, and obviously Bush and others have had great speechwriters, was Peggy Noonan. And Peggy was not, many speechwriters write for the history books, so they write these extraordinary, you read the document and you say, wow, that's really interesting. Peggy had been Dan Rather's writer on CBS News, and she understood the spoken word. Ronald Reagan, having been a communicator in both movies and commentary and what have you, he understood the spoken word is different than the written word. So basically, writing for the written word, which is you hear it differently than you do visually, is very, very important in this day and age.
Other questions? Down there?
Thank you. Building off of the previous question that was asked, I wanted the opinion of the panel on how quickly the innovation of technology will affect policymaking in the future.
You mean policy making directly about technology, or policy making in the very broadest sense?
In a sense, about technology as well. Technology that's in the hand of civilians, but also from a military standpoint. Relatively speaking, policymaking tends to be slower, and at least speaking in terms of the Bush administration, since then to the modern day, we've seen rapid leaps and bounds in the type of technology that's available all around us, both to us and to our enemies. So I was wondering how developing and managing policymaking as technology advances, like what are the changes that you'll be seeing?
In terms of the technology itself, you're seeing huge battles over things that most Americans don't understand, like net neutrality. If you go down in the subway this afternoon and ask about net neutrality to anybody over 40, they're gonna have no idea what you're talking about, chances are. And those are huge battlegrounds. And I think they're not well understood by people who are making the policies, because most of them are over 40. And the long-term implications of what they are, I think, are well understood by the people who use the net. The second piece is about security. Obviously, policy is going to change dramatically. And again, Mike Hayden this morning gave a terrific talk about the balance between listening in and how many people you have to listen in on. In the old days, you could listen in on a few people and find out all the things that you needed to do that were the security threats to the country. Today, you have to listen in on 300 million people and cull everything electronically to pick out the likely things. And that's so clearly, and you can't do it any other way, because the diffuseness, since you don't have a nation state that's a danger to us as much as a diffuse movement of individuals, any one of whom in any location in the world could get an arm or a weapon and harm people, you have to have this huge catchment. So I think the nature of security policy is going to change dramatically, and is already changing dramatically ahead of time. And then finally, of course, we get back to what we've been talking about, is the nature of technology changes the way in which you talk about policy. And if the way you talk about policy has to change, then probably the way you formulate policy is going to change as a result. Although I have to do some more thinking about that, because I think that's the most complex interaction.
One of the things we notice in Washington is that laws and regulations aren't keeping up with technology. You look at the Patriot Act and NSA surveillance. I mean, they can't write laws fast enough to keep up with how fast technology grows. And also, members of Congress are not always that tech savvy. Lindsey Graham saying he doesn't even do his own Twitter feed. He's never sent an email. These are U.S. senators.
Well, not a qualification to be a Twitter expert to be a U.S. senator. The requirement is to be 30 years old and live in the country.
Putting the twit in Twitter?
One of the things I think, one of the things that I'm concerned about as a communicator is that I was not a great student, and I basically, my daughter harasses me all the time about that. I graduated in the upper 2/3 of my graduating class, because I'm sure the bottom flunked. But I was always a reader, and I always read 6 newspapers a day, and I knew every point of view. And I evolved from a kind of a liberal Kennedy Democrat to the right of most people in this room, probably. But I think at the end of the day, one of the things that bothers me today, when it comes to the technology question, is people very narrow what they want to read. Their time is very limited, and so you have the capacity to basically say, I'm not going to read any of that. I'm not going to read any conservative junk. I'm going to read these 3 things every day so I know what's happening. And my sense is that's a very dangerous thing long term, because it obviously reinforces your point of view, and so you don't see a broader picture, and there's no flexibility. And what I have said repeatedly to my students here and to people around the country, all of the issues we deal with today as Americans, whether it's Congress or what have you, all the policy issues are all very complex. There's no easy answers. If there were easy answers, it'd be done. Peter Kalikow would fix education in New York City with his dedication that he's done to other things. If it was easy, it's not easy. He did a great job fixing the transportation system, but he doesn't want another run at it. At the end of the day, I just hope that as you young people, when you think in terms of policy, you have to have a broader scope. And I think the thing that scares me the most about technology, and I have my iPad, I basically do everything I can for an old man, as Howard said, who watches Fox News or appears on Fox News, with the other 4 million people a day, Howard, but that's okay. We have this running, he has 200,000 people watch him on MSNBC, and he brags about that all the time, and I have 4 million people that don't care about what Howard says every day. So I just think it's important. I just think it's important that, and the most telling thing to me is the statistic that 96 million jobs are going to be eliminated in the next 10 years by technology. That's a very significant number. And so we've got to basically think in terms of, so we come to the policy question, okay, technology is great, all the rest of it. How do we create 96 million jobs in other areas? And the difference in society in 1900 was a blacksmith and a medical doctor graduating from Harvard. They were the most educated man in America, extremely valuable. That blacksmith on most days was every bit as valuable. Today, the difference between the most educated people in the society, which is many of you here, and those who aren't educated and those who can't deal with technology and what have you, that gap, it's not just the economic gap, it's the ability to deal in the next new world that scares me and frightens me, and we need to deal with it.
Let me take a quick minute to address your question specifically about policymaking as it relates to the Bush White House, because I think 9/11 exposed for us that we weren't prepared. You'll remember that when President Bush had left Sarasota, Florida, and then had flown across the country, that the technology wasn't sufficient enough for him to be able to communicate in live time with his advisors. I mean, he had spotty communications. Sometimes he'd get signals, sometimes it would go out. And if you read his book, Decision Points, the president also notes that oftentimes when they're flying across the country, they had to tune into local news stations on Air Force One because they didn't have the technology to communicate and to look at more secure communications. For us, with the vice president being off and gone, we had to deal with him and to communicate with him via secure satellite feeds. Sometimes those would go out. The White House Situation Room had to be dramatically upgraded so the president had the ability to talk to foreign leaders in different countries at the same time and to conduct those meetings. So I think from a technological standpoint, the Obama administration has really benefited from the advances in technology, because I can tell you on September 11, 2001, it really showed you how inadequate the president's communications were so that he could adequately formulate policies to work with his policy staff to really try to get a hold of the situation that he was dealing with.
At the back of the room there.
My question is directed toward Ed Rollins. You were saying that the message should be controlled, but over the last 50 years, clearly the people don't want control. It didn't work for Nixon, he had to resign. It hasn't worked for Reagan because now we see with the Iran-Contra affair. It didn't work for Clinton when he tried to deal with Monica Lewinsky. And what you were basically saying was that you should try to work through the clutter. But shouldn't you just stay in the same position and try to find the gems within the clutter to get your message straight across?
You're talking about two different things. You're talking about specific policies that turned out. When I say controlled, I'm talking in terms of a message. If I want to basically, I'm the president of the United States, or I'm the governor of a state, and I want to talk about the things that I think are important to the country, because I need support from the country to either get something passed in the Congress or what have you. Take Obamacare. During the Obamacare debate, the president needed to control the agenda to go get people across the country to support his program. Now, if I stood up and basically said, hey, let's talk about 50 other things, I'm not talking about manipulation. I'm talking about the element of how you do your messaging. And as any of you that are going to get into communications have to understand, and it's not a negative thing, it's a positive thing. It's what, if you want to have a conversation with someone and you have a point of view and you want to express your point of view, you don't want to talk about 55,000 things. It's like the guy who goes in the country club and he sits next to the guy at the bar and he said, do you like sports? I said, I love sports. So this guy then proceeds for the next 45 minutes to talk about golf. I walk out of the restaurant, out of the bar, and I'm bored to death. I go out, my wife says, how was that conversation? I said, it was terrible. This guy bullshitted about his golf game, and I hate golf. You got to ask a second question. Do you like football? Do you like sports? Do you like baseball? And my point is, as a president, it doesn't do any good for the president to basically, if there's 500 people in this room who want to ask 500 questions, I'm not going to be able to articulate my message. My message is this. Obamacare is the important thing for me this week. Iran-Contra deal is the important thing for me this week. I have to use the media as my vehicle to get to the country. It's not a manipulated. So, I mean, obviously Iran-Contra would have much rather not to had Iran-Contra. Much rather a lot of other things that occurred. That had nothing to do with messaging. That had to do with Monica Lewinsky, obviously, was something the president would much rather have not had to discuss or debate. But at the end of the day, you know, my point here is how you communicate with the country, and the country wants to know what the government is doing, what the leader's doing.
Okay. More questions at the very back there.
Thank you. I'd like to compliment you panelists for living history. You were part of this great American story. Now I have a futuristic question. We're at President Bush's seminar, and I would like to ask all of you to comment. Do you see the president's brother, Jeb, as the next president, or his good friend Bill Clinton's wife, Hillary, as the next president? Thank you.
Maybe. I think Jeb Bush is an extraordinary man, and he was always the Bush that was sort of assumed to someday be the president, to follow his father. He's got, you know, we've got a very crowded field on our side. We probably have the best field of candidates since 1980. We have several very competent governors. We have several senators. We have some extremely articulate men and a woman who's articulate, who's in the race at this point. We probably have 20 candidates. So for Jeb to win, he's got a base. He's not going to get it handed to him. He's going to get a lot of money handed to him, but he's got to go run a very effective campaign, and he has to overcome some of the negativity that unfortunately is left over, as we've discovered the last several days from the George W. And people really want a third. I think in the case of Hillary, it's a little bit different. She is, if her name was Bill Clinton Jr., she may be challenged. She's not being challenged in the democratic process at this point in time. You're the expert on Democrats. I don't think anyone's going to run against her of any significance. I think she will be the nominee. I think we're going to have a real robust race. So it could easily be a Bush-Clinton campaign. At this point in time on my side, it's too difficult to predict who's going to come out of my side and win.
There have been a lot of focus groups and lots of polls and stuff that show that Jeb Bush has some serious problems in the early states. Voters are actually hostile to him, his name, his positions, obviously on Common Core and immigration and more. So I don't think he's a lock to get the Republican nomination at all. I don't know who is. I mean, I think it's sort of folly this early to try to predict. I agree it'll probably be Hillary Clinton, but I think that her numbers are already coming down, or I should say her disapproval ratings are going up as she gets more partisan. She certainly benefited from really high job approval numbers when she was Secretary of State. It's not a very political job. I think voters, even Democratic voters, are going to wish they had more choices.
I think Hillary is likely to be the nominee because I don't think anybody else is likely to run, barring some who knows what, and who knows what happens a lot in politics and for every race. I think the Republicans, I think their most formidable candidate would be Jeb Bush, because I think Jeb Bush is closer to the center than the other candidates on the Republican side, and I think this is a center country. I agree that Jeb Bush may not win. Scott Walker, who I think is basically an empty suit, devoid of principle, but he's a hell of a good politician, and I think he could, if the conservative vote crystallizes around him, I think they could dispossess Jeb of the nomination. I think Ted Cruz's presence in the nomination harms Scott Walker because he's going to pull off 10 or 15% of people who are willing to vote for somebody who has absolutely no platform whatsoever, except I hate everything, and government is at the top. So, you know, it's an interesting race. I don't think this is the most formidable field that's ever been raised in the Republican, because I think 3/4 of them are completely unqualified to be president of the United States. But there are candidates who are well qualified. I agree some of the other, if John Kasich gets in, he's well qualified to be president. I would disagree with him and I wouldn't support him, but he's the real deal. And there are a few other people that are the real deal. But most of them I don't think are a hell of a lot better than the last crew, and that was a lot of fun for us.
I just want to, this is not partisanship. What made you qualified as governor of Vermont that you could run for president, and these other governors of other states are not qualified to run for president?
Well, you may remember I got my ass kicked.
And they may also. But I think they're not, this is not as well known. You know, the interesting thing about American politics, you get known overnight. Just take Sarah Palin, who had never talked to more than 300 people. The next day she had 100% name ID.
Yeah, but you're not arguing that she was qualified to be president.
I'm not arguing anything. I'm just basically saying in the day and age today, we have some governors. We have 31 governors. There's 4 or 5 going to run. Every bit as, and I like Kasich, every bit as good as Kasich. Right. And I think to a certain extent, the field, it's a big, important field, and I think we will basically have a formidable candidate to run against Mrs. Clinton.
Well, I think that we can only say to be continued, and thanks to our panelists, thanks to you for coming, and there are many more panels over the course of the day, and I encourage everyone who can to attend as many as possible. Thank you.